The Silent Appraisal. Section 1. The Weight of a Key. The sound of a suitcase dragging across the hardwood floor used to be a signal of comfort. It meant the house was full again. But as I sat in the darkened study, watching the headlights of Sarah's Uber sweep across the living room walls, the sound felt like a countdown. She didn't know that the lock had been changed 2 days ago, or that the person who changed it was currently sitting 3 feet away from her jewelry box with a legal pad and a mountain of silence. I stayed in the shadows, listening to the metallic rattle of her key hitting the strike plate. Once, twice, the frustrated huff she gave when the cylinder wouldn't turn. It was the sound of a woman who assumed her position was permanent. I realized then that the most dangerous thing you can give someone isn't your trust, but the illusion that they have successfully deceived you. For 6 months, I had played the role of the oblivious husband, the man who worked too late and asked too few questions. I watched her curate a life that didn't include me while using the resources I provided to build a bridge to someone else. She thought she was moving toward a brighter shore. She didn't realize I was the one holding the bridge up, and I had just decided to let go. The door finally opened, not because she found the right key, but because I walked over and turned the deadbolt from the inside. I didn't smile. I didn't offer to take her bag. I simply stood there in the dim light of the foyer, watching her eyes adjust. She looked radiant, flushed with the kind of glow that doesn't come from a spa weekend with the girls. It was the glow of someone who believed they were getting away with everything. "The lock is sticking, Mark," she said, her voice breezy, already moving past me toward the kitchen. "We really need to have someone look at that." My weekend was exhausting. The girls were so loud, I think I need another vacation just to recover from the vacation. I stayed silent because any word I spoke would be a wasted currency. I followed her into the kitchen, watching her movements. She was practiced. She reached for the wine glasses. She checked the mail on the counter, which I had carefully curated to remove anything incriminating, and she began a monologue about a fictional brunch in Sedona. I leaned against the doorframe, calculating the distance between her lie and the truth, tucked away in a folder on my desk. I understood then that power isn't about the reveal, it's about the interval between knowing the truth and acting on it. Every minute she spent describing the scenery was another brick in the wall she was building around herself. She asked how my weekend was. Her back turned to me as she poured a glass of Sauvignon Blanc. I told her it was productive. I told her I spent a lot of time thinking about the future of the house. She laughed, a light, melodic sound that used to make me feel at peace, but now sounded like glass breaking in a far-off room. "The house? It's fine, Mark. Maybe we can repaint the guest room this spring," she suggested. I didn't tell her that the guest room had already been emptied. I didn't tell her that the "for sale" sign wasn't just a physical object in the yard, but a metaphor for the entire life we had built. I watched her take a sip of wine, her wedding ring catching the light, a ring I had paid for with a bonus from a deal that nearly broke me. She looked at me, really looked at me for the first time since walking through the door, and her smile faltered just a fraction. There was a coldness in the room that the heater couldn't touch. "You're being very quiet," she noted, setting the glass down. "Is something wrong at the firm?" "Everything is exactly where it needs to be," I replied. I felt the psychological pressure beginning to shift. For months, she had held the leverage of the secret. Now, the secret was mine, and the weight of it was beginning to press down on her, even if she couldn't identify the source of the gravity. She started to recount a story about her friend Chloe, but her pacing was off. She was checking my face for a reaction, searching for the old Mark, who would nod and laugh and offer a foot rub. That man was gone. In his place was an architect of a very different kind of ending. I realize that the moment you stop reacting to a liar, you become their greatest fear. They rely on your feedback to calibrate their deception. Without it, they begin to drift. Sarah drifted into the living room, her voice trailing off as she noticed the lack of personal items on the mantel. I had spent the weekend removing the photographs, the small trinkets from our travels, the things that made this a home instead of a structure. She stopped in front of the empty space where our wedding photo used to sit. "Where's the picture, Mark?" she asked, her voice losing its breezy edge. "It was out of date," I said simply. "The lighting was wrong. It didn't reflect the current reality." She turned to look at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw the mask slip. Fear flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by a practiced indignation. She was going to try to turn it on me. She was going to ask if I was having a moment. But before she could speak, the motion sensor light in the driveway clicked on, illuminating the yard. She walked to the window, peering through the blinds. I stayed where I was, listening to the sound of her breath catching. The silence in the house was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. She stood there for a long time, her hand trembling slightly on the slat of the blind. "Mark," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "why is there a sign in our yard?" Section 2. The Inventory of Loss. The question hung in the air, vibrating with a sudden, sharp clarity. I didn't move from my spot by the kitchen island. I didn't rush to comfort her or offer a frantic explanation. I simply picked up my coffee mug, which had gone cold, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The "For Sale" sign was a silent sentinel in the darkness outside. But inside, the true transaction had already been completed. "I decided it was time to downsize," I said, my voice as level as a horizon. "The overhead on this life has become unsustainable." Sarah turned away from the window, her face pale. The indignation she had been prepared to weaponize was replaced by a frantic, searching confusion. "Downsize? Mark, we haven't even talked about moving. This is our home. You can't just put a sign in the yard without consulting me. Is this some kind of joke? A midlife crisis?" I stayed silent because the explanation she wanted was a trap. If I explained, I was negotiating. If I negotiated, I was acknowledging that she still had a seat at the table. I walked past her into the living room and sat in the leather chair that faced the empty mantel. I looked at her, not with anger, but with the detached interest of an auditor. I understood that she wasn't upset about the house. She was upset about the loss of control. The house was the stage upon which she performed her perfect wife routine, the base of operations for her excursions into a life she thought I was subsidizing blindly. By putting the house on the market, I wasn't just selling property, I was dismantling her stage. "Sit down, Sarah," I said. It wasn't a command, but it had the weight of one. She didn't sit, she paced. "I'm not sitting down. I want to know what's going on. I go away for 3 days to get some clarity, and I come back to a for sale sign. You're acting like a stranger. Did something happen at work? Are we in financial trouble?" "We are in an integrity deficit," I replied. The phrase hit her, and I watched her process it. She tried to laugh it off, a nervous, jagged sound. "Integrity deficit? What is that, some corporate speak?" "Mark, you're scaring me. You're acting like you don't even care about us." "I care about the truth," I said, "and the truth is that this house is built on a foundation that has rotted. I'm simply a man who knows when a structure is no longer safe to inhabit." I watched her mind racing, trying to figure out how much I knew. This is the part of the slow burn where the heat begins to blister the skin. She was mentally scrolling through her weekend, her texts, her spa receipts. She was looking for the leak. She didn't realize the entire haul had already vanished. I realized that watching a person try to maintain a lie is like watching someone try to catch water in a sieve. The harder they try, the more exhausted they become. She began to talk faster, a stream of consciousness designed to distract me. She talked about her commitment, about how hard she worked to keep our social life active, about how much she sacrificed to be the woman I needed. "I've done everything for this marriage," she claimed, her voice rising just a pitch. "And you repay me by putting our home on the market behind my back? Do you know how humiliating that is? What will the neighbors think?" "The neighbors are already talking, Sarah. But not about the sign," I said. I let that statement hang. I didn't elaborate. I let her imagination fill in the blanks. Did the neighbors see her leaving at odd hours? Did they see the car that shouldn't have been in the driveway? The pressure was no longer coming from me. It was coming from the environment I had created. She was trapped in a room of her own making, and the walls were closing in. She finally sat down, the air seemingly leaving her lungs in one long, shaky exhale. "What do you want, Mark? If you're unhappy, we can talk. We can go to counseling. But this is extreme." "I don't want to talk," I said, standing up. "I've already talked to the realtor, the movers, and the lawyers. The inventory of this house has been taken. Everything that belongs to me is being packed tomorrow. Everything that belongs to you, well, you'll have to decide where that goes." I walked toward the stairs, my footsteps heavy and rhythmic on the wood. I could feel her eyes on my back, a mix of terror and growing realization. She followed me to the base of the stairs, her hand gripping the banister. "You can't do this," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You can't just end a decade of marriage because you've decided to be cold. There's a process. There are rules." "The rules changed when the contract was breached," I said, looking down at her from the third step. "I'm just the one enforcing the exit clause." I reached the landing and turned back. She was standing in the foyer, framed by the empty space where our life used to be. She looked small. For the first time, the status she had built for herself, the designer clothes, the perfect hair, the social standing, seemed like a costume that was 2 sizes too big. "By the way," I added, my voice casual, as if remembering a minor detail, "I hope you enjoyed Sedona. It's a beautiful place this time of year, especially the Enchantment Resort. Although I hear the room service for 2 is quite expensive." The blood drained from her face so completely she looked like a ghost. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. I had given her the fragment. I had confirmed I knew the location, the cost, and the company, without saying a single name. I went into the master bedroom and locked the door. I didn't go to sleep. I sat in the chair by the window and watched the "For Sale" sign catch the gleam of a passing car's lights. The silence in the house was now punctuated by the sound of her muffled sobbing from the living room, but it didn't move me. It was just another sound of a structure collapsing. An hour later, I heard her footsteps on the stairs. They were hesitant, stopping outside the bedroom door. There was a long silence. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then I heard the faint sound of a phone vibrating. It wasn't mine. It was hers, left in her purse on the landing. I heard her pick it up. I heard the frantic tapping of fingers on glass. She was reaching out to the one person she thought she had left. I smiled to myself in the dark. She didn't know that the phone she was holding was also part of the inventory I had already cleared. "Mark?" she whispered through the door, her voice cracking. "Mark, please, who told you?" I didn't answer. I let the question fester. The who wasn't important. The what was already done. I stood up and walked to the door, but I didn't open it. I leaned my forehead against the wood, listening to her ragged breathing on the other side. "Sarah," I said quietly, "check your email. I sent you the final walkthrough instructions." I heard her move away from the door. I heard her phone chime with a notification. I knew what she was seeing, not a walkthrough of the house, but a chronological timeline of her weekend, complete with time-stamped photos that hadn't come from a private investigator, but from a source she would never suspect. I sat back down and waited. The real show was about to begin, and I had the best seat in the house. Section 3. The Ghost in the Machine. I heard the sharp, jagged intake of breath through the door, the sound of a person realizing the floor they were standing on had actually been a trap door all along. The email wasn't just a list of grievances, it was a digital ledger of every moment she thought was private. I had spent months leaning into the silence, not because I was grieving, but because I was gathering. I realized that the greatest weakness of a person living a double life is their absolute reliance on technology to bridge the gap between their two worlds. I stayed seated in the darkness of the master bedroom. I didn't need to see her face to know the exact moment she reached the third attachment. It was a photo of a receipt from a boutique in Sedona for a silk tie that I didn't own and a bottle of cologne that wasn't my brand. The beauty of digital footprints is that they are indelible. She had used a joint credit card for a miscellaneous expense, thinking I never checked the itemized statements. I stayed silent because my voice was now being projected through the screen in her hand. "Mark?" Her voice was a ghost of itself, drifting through the doorframe. How long have you had this?" "Long enough to know that the woman I married exists only in the past tense," I replied. I understood that she was now looking for a way to negotiate. In her mind, if she could explain the why, she could mitigate the what. But I had removed the whys from the equation entirely. In a corporate restructuring, you don't ask why the department failed, you simply look at the balance sheet and realize the department is no longer viable. Our marriage was a failed subsidiary, and I was the liquidator. The house felt larger now, hollowed out by the revelation. I heard her slide down the wall on the other side of the door. The rustle of her silk blouse against the paint was the only sound in the hallway. She was waiting for me to come out and scream. She wanted the release of a confrontation, the heat of an argument where she could cry, apologize, and eventually find a way to make me feel guilty for her choices. I refused to give her that oxygen. "It was just once," she whispered, the classic opening line of the desperate. "It didn't mean anything. It was a mistake, Mark." Sedona was. It was a moment of weakness. A moment of weakness usually doesn't involve a 3-month paper trail and a pre-planned itinerary, I said, my voice devoid of any tremor. A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. What you did was an investment. You invested your time, your emotion, and our shared resources into another person. I'm just closing the account. I realized then that she was terrified, not of losing me, but of losing the lifestyle I provided. The house, the status, the security, those were the things she was grieving. I watched the shadows of the trees outside dance across the ceiling. I felt a strange sense of clarity. By remaining behind the locked door, I was maintaining the psychological high ground. I was the one who knew the full scope. She was the one begging for the boundaries of my knowledge. "Who is he to you, Sarah?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Is he the man you thought would be standing here when the for sale sign went up? Because I checked his LinkedIn today. He's currently on a flight back to his own wife in Chicago. He hasn't answered your last 3 texts, has he?" The silence that followed was my confirmation. The pressure in the room reached a fever pitch. She had been betrayed by her accomplice just as she had betrayed her partner. She was now truly alone in the house we built, surrounded by the ghosts of her own making. I heard her phone hit the floor, a dull thud on the carpet. I understood that the silent endurance phase of my plan was over. The observation had yielded its results. Now the quiet power shift was becoming visible. I wasn't just a husband she had cheated on, I was the architect of her new reality, and that reality was becoming smaller by the second. Section 4. The Valuation of Truth. The sun began to bleed through the blinds, casting long, orange stripes across the bedroom floor. I hadn't slept, but I wasn't tired. There is a specific kind of adrenaline that comes with finality. I heard Sarah move from the hallway. The shower in the guest bathroom turned on. She was trying to wash off the weekend, trying to reset, trying to find a version of herself that could face me in the light of day. I opened the bedroom door and walked down to the kitchen. The house was cold. I began to make coffee, the grinding of the beans a harsh, industrial sound in the stillness. I moved with a sense of purpose. I had a folder on the kitchen island, a physical manifestation of the email I had sent. It contained the listing agreement, the divorce filing, and a pre-written statement for our families. I realized that the hardest part of this process wasn't the discovery of her betrayal. It was the realization of how little I actually felt now that the truth was out. The love hadn't turned to hate, it had turned to data. She was a liability that needed to be offloaded. Sarah entered the kitchen 10 minutes later. She had put on a conservative sweater and slacks, her hair pulled back tightly. She was trying to look like the reliable Sarah again. She sat at the island, her hands folded, looking at the folder but not touching it. "I called a lawyer," she said, her voice attempting to regain some of its old authority. "You can't sell the house without my signature. We're in a community property state, Mark. You're acting like this is a solo venture. It's not." "You're right," I said, pushing a cup of coffee toward her. "It's not a solo venture, which is why I've already contacted your father." She froze. The coffee steam rose between us like a veil. Her father was a man of old-school principles, a man who had walked her down the aisle and told me that his daughter's honor was his own. He was also the primary investor in the boutique she wanted to open next year. "You did what?" she breathed, her composure shattering. "I told him the truth, Sarah. Not because I wanted revenge, but because he's a partner in your future business. And as an investor, he deserved to know that his partner lacks the fundamental character to manage a long-term contract." I stayed silent as the weight of that realization settled on her. I wasn't just ending our marriage. I was dismantling her future support system. I wasn't doing it with a shout. I was doing it with a phone call and a series of facts. I understood that dominance isn't about physical strength. It's about controlling the narrative before the other person even knows there's a story being told. "He won't believe you," she said, though her eyes told a different story. "He already does. I sent him the same email I sent you. He's a man of his word, Sarah. He was quite disappointed." The psychological pressure was now absolute. She had no move left. Her leverage was gone. Her secret was public. Her future was uncertain. She looked at the folder on the table, her hand trembling as she finally reached for it. She flipped through the pages of the divorce filing, her eyes scanning the no-fault clause. "You're giving me the house?" she asked, her voice confused. Her secret was gone. Her secret was public. Her future was uncertain. She looked at the folder on the table, her hand trembling as she finally reached for it. "No," I said, leaning forward. "I'm giving you the equity. I'm taking the house. I've already bought out your portion of the mortgage using the funds from the account you thought I didn't know about, the one you were hiding for your exit fund. Consider it a forced buyout." I realized that the look on her face wasn't just sadness. It was a profound, ego-bruising realization that I had been 3 steps ahead of her for the better part of a year. I had watched her save that money dollar by dollar, thinking she was being clever. I had simply waited for the balance to reach the exact amount I needed to settle the debt. "You've been planning this," she whispered. "You didn't just find out this weekend." "I found out in July," I said. "I spent the last few months making sure that when the end came, it would be clean, efficient, and final." She looked around the kitchen. The high-end appliances, the custom cabinets, the life we had curated for the eyes of others, it was all slipping away. The "for sale" sign in the yard wasn't for the public. It was a signifier to her that the era of her occupancy was over. "Where am I supposed to go?" she asked, a genuine note of panic entering her voice. "That's the beauty of your new independence, Sarah," I said, standing up and picking up my briefcase. "You get to decide, just like you decided to go to Sedona." I walked toward the door, stopping only to look back at her one last time. She was sitting in the light of the morning sun, surrounded by the wreckage of a life she had devalued. "The movers will be here at noon," I said. "I'd suggest you start with the guest room. It's already empty." I walked out the front door, the click of the lock behind me sounding like the final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. I walked past the "For Sale" sign, not feeling regret, but a quiet, cold satisfaction. I got into my car and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw her in the rearview mirror, standing at the window, watching me leave. She looked like a stranger in a house that no longer belonged to her. But as I reached the end of the street, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a message from an unknown number. "She's not the only one with secrets, Mark. Check the vent in the study." Section 5. The Cold Architecture of Truth. The text message sat on my dashboard like a digital landmine. In the calculated world I had built over the last 6 months, there was no room for unknown numbers or hidden vents. I pulled the car to the curb 3 blocks away from the house, the engine idling with a low, rhythmic hum that mirrored the sudden pounding in my chest. I realized that even the most meticulous architect can miss a structural flaw if they are too focused on the facade. I stayed silent, staring at the screen, processing the possibility that Sarah wasn't the only one playing a game of shadows. I understood that power is a fragile thing. It relies entirely on the quality of your information. If someone else had information I lacked, the leverage I had just exerted in the kitchen was an illusion. I turned the car around. My movement back toward the house was not fueled by panic, but by a cold, clinical necessity to maintain total control. I parked a street over and walked back, entering through the garage. The house felt different now, no longer a trophy to be sold, but a crime scene yet to be fully processed. I made my way to the study, my footsteps light on the Persian rug. The room smelled of old paper and the expensive bourbon I used to drink when I thought my life was stable. I knelt by the floor vent behind the mahogany desk, a spot hidden by a heavy velvet curtain. I realized that I had spent years sitting in this chair, managing millions of dollars in assets, while a secret might have been breathing right beneath my feet. With a pocket knife, I pried the metal grate loose. It came away with a sharp, protesting screech. Tucked inside the galvanized steel duct was a small, leather-bound ledger and a flash drive. I didn't open them immediately. I sat on the floor, the cold air from the HVAC system blowing against my face. I understood that this was the moment where the narrative could shift. Was this Sarah's insurance policy, or was it something else? Something left behind by the man she had been seeing, a way to keep a tether on her. I realized that the silent dominance I practiced required me to be the only one with the map. Finding a new set of coordinates was a threat to my very identity. I opened the ledger. It wasn't Sarah's handwriting. It was a meticulous record of dates, times, and numbers that had nothing to do with her boutique or her affair. It was a record of my own firm's off-book transactions details that only my senior partner, Elias, and I should have known. I realized then that the betrayal I was dealing with wasn't just domestic. It was systemic. The psychological pressure shifted from my marriage to my very survival. I stayed silent because the implications were deafening. Someone had been using my home as a dead drop. Someone knew the layout of my life better than I did. I looked at the flash drive, a small piece of plastic that suddenly felt heavier than the house itself. I realized that my quiet power shift was being overshadowed by a much larger shadow. The "For Sale" sign in the yard was no longer just a way to evict a cheating wife. It was a beacon for whoever was watching this house. I heard the floorboards creak in the hallway. Sarah was moving. She was likely packing, her world in tatters, unaware that the man who had just dismantled her life was currently sitting on the floor of his study, holding a secret that could dismantle his. I understood that I couldn't let her see me. If she knew I had returned, the equilibrium of her fear would break. I tucked the ledger and the drive into my jacket and replaced the vent cover. I realized that the moral victory I was seeking was becoming complicated by a much more primal need for security. Every section of this story had been about my competence, my restraint, and my timing. But as I stood up, I felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in years, the sensation of being watched. I looked at the window, at the "For Sale" sign reflecting the morning sun, and I wondered if I was the one who had been sold. Section 6. The Invisible Hand. The silence of the house was now a predator. I retreated from the study and slipped back out through the garage, my mind a blur of variables. I drove to a quiet park and opened the flash drive on my laptop. The files were encrypted, but the folder names were clear enough. Project Phoenix, Escrow Divergence, and a file simply labeled Mark's Exit. I realized that the unknown number wasn't a threat. It was a whistleblower, or perhaps a lure. I stayed silent because the internal monologue of a man in my position is a constant calculation of risk. I understood that Sarah's affair was a distraction, a well-timed emotional crisis that had kept me focused on the bedroom while the vault was being emptied. I realized that her weekend in Sedona might have been more than a tryst. It might have been the window of opportunity Elias needed to finalize the divergence. The humiliation I felt wasn't just about my wife's infidelity. It was about my own blindness. I began to see the social imbalance for what it truly was. I had treated Sarah like a subordinate to be managed, while my business partners had treated me like a target to be neutralized. The psychological pressure was now mounting from two fronts. I had to maintain the cold husband persona to keep Sarah in check, while simultaneously becoming a ghost to uncover the corporate rot. I realized that the silent endurance I had practiced was about to become my greatest weapon. I drove to my office, not as the boss, but as a ghost. I didn't use the front elevator. I used the service entrance, the one the cleaning crews used. I understood that to find the truth, I had to move through the world in the spaces no one bothered to look at. I watched from the shadows of the break room as Elias walked past, laughing at a joke a junior associate was telling. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had successfully offloaded his problems onto someone else. I realized that the moral victory I wanted wasn't just against a cheating spouse, but against a corrupt system. The "For Sale" sign was still in my yard, and the movers were still coming for Sarah at noon. I had to play both roles. I called Sarah from a burner phone. "Change of plans," I said, my voice a whisper of the coldness I had shown earlier. "I want you out by 10 a.m. Leave the keys on the island. If you're still there when I return, the deal regarding your father is off." "Mark, please," she started, her voice cracking. 10 a.m., Sarah. Not a minute later. I hung up. I realized that by accelerating her departure, I was clearing the stage. I needed the house empty so I could meet the unknown number there. I understood that whoever sent that text wanted to see me. They knew about the vent, they knew about the ledger, and they knew I would come back. I returned to the house at 10:15 a.m. Sarah's car was gone. The "For Sale" sign stood solitary in the yard, a marker of a life that had been liquidated. I entered the kitchen. The keys were on the island, just as I had commanded, but next to the keys was something I hadn't expected. It was a small, handwritten note from Sarah. "I'm sorry for Sedona, but I wasn't the one who put the ledger in the vent, Mark. I found it 3 weeks ago. I was too afraid to tell you because I thought it was yours." I realized that the betrayal confirmed stage of my arc was evolving. She hadn't been the one hiding it from me to hurt me. She had been hiding it because she thought I was the criminal. The irony was a bitter pill. Our marriage had died in a vacuum of communication where even our secrets were misunderstood. I stayed silent, the note in my hand, as a black sedan pulled into the driveway. It didn't belong to the movers. It belonged to the firm. I realized that the quiet power shift was about to become a loud confrontation. I moved to the window, watching the door of the sedan open. I understood that I was no longer just the man selling a house. I was the man holding the evidence of a decade's worth of crime, standing in a structure that was about to be surrounded. The moral closure I sought was drifting further away, replaced by a desperate need to find out who was actually driving the car. I stood in the center of the living room, the ledger in one hand and a flash drive in the other. I realized that the next few minutes would decide if I was the master of this story or just another character being written out. The doorbell rang, a sharp, demanding sound that cut through the silence like a blade. I walked to the door, my hand on the lock. I realized that the man on the other side wasn't Elias, and it wasn't a process server. "Open the door, Mark," a familiar voice said through the wood. "We need to talk about what you found in the vent." Section 7. The Master of the House. The voice through the door belonged to Elias's head of security, a man named Miller, who had spent 15 years making sure the firm's irregularities stayed invisible. I realized in that heartbeat that my silence hadn't just been a shield, it had been an invitation. By not reacting to the initial corporate leaks months ago, I had signaled to the predators that the territory was undefended. I stayed silent, my hand resting on the cold brass of the deadbolt, feeling the vibration of Miller's breathing on the other side. This was the moment I understood that the house wasn't being sold because of a divorce. It was being sold because it was the last piece of evidence connecting me to a crime I hadn't committed. "I know you're in there, Mark," Miller said, his tone devoid of any heat. "And I know what's in your jacket pocket. Let's make this professional. The sign is in the yard. The wife is gone. You're halfway to a clean break. Don't ruin the exit strategy over a ledger that doesn't belong to you." I understood then that the unknown number hadn't been a whistleblower. It had been Miller. It was a test of my curiosity, a way to see if I would take the bait and return to the house after Sarah left. If I had stayed in my car and kept driving, I would have been safe. But my need for absolute dominance, my need to know every secret under my roof, had brought me back to the cage. I realized that my own ego was the architect of this specific trap. I turned the lock and opened the door. I didn't back away. I stood in the threshold, forcing him to look at me in the daylight. Miller was dressed in a sharp gray suit that cost more than my first car. He looked like success, but he smelled like the exhaust of a running engine. I didn't offer him entry. I simply stood there, the ledger a heavy weight against my ribs. "The exit strategy was mine, Miller," I said, my voice as cold as the morning frost on the grass. "Elias doesn't get to dictate the terms of my retirement, and he certainly doesn't get to use my home as a filing cabinet for his fraud." I realized that the psychological pressure had reached its zenith. Miller wasn't here to kill me, not yet. He was here to negotiate the return of the data. In the world of high-stakes finance, a body is a liability, but a ledger is a death sentence. I stayed silent because I needed him to fill the gap with an offer. I watched his eyes flick to the for sale sign and then back to me. "The house is already under contract, Mark," Miller said, a thin smile touching his lips. "An anonymous LLC bought it 3 hours ago. Full cash offer, no inspections. You're already a guest in someone else's property. If you leave now and hand over the drive, the wire transfer clears by noon. You get the equity, you get the divorce, and you get to disappear with your dignity. If you don't, well, the for sale sign might be the last thing people remember about this address." I understood the play. They were buying the house to destroy the evidence in the vents and to buy my silence with the very money they had stolen from the firm. It was a closed loop, a perfect circular betrayal. I realized that the moral victory I had envisioned was being replaced by a much darker necessity. I wasn't just fighting for my marriage or my reputation anymore. I was fighting for the right to not be erased. "I don't care about the money," I said, stepping back to allow him into the foyer. "I care about the valuation. And right now, your information is undervalued." I led him into the study, the very room where I had dismantled Sarah's life only hours before. The empty space on the mantel where our wedding photo once sat felt like a hollowed-out eye watching us. I sat behind the desk, the master of a dying empire. Miller stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the sign in the yard. "What do you want, Mark?" he asked. "You've already burned your bridges. Your wife is gone. Your career is over. What's left?" "Timing," I replied. "I want the time it takes for a certain email to reach the Department of Justice. An email that was set to send the moment you walked through that door." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the mask of professional calm slide off Miller's face. I realized that in his world, he was the one who controlled the clock. I had just taken the battery out. Section 8. The Final Walkthrough. The realization hit Miller like a physical blow. He didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for his phone, his fingers flying across the screen as he tried to contact Elias. I stayed seated, my hands folded on the mahogany desk. I realized that the ultimate form of power isn't the ability to destroy someone, it's the ability to watch them realize they've already destroyed themselves. The quiet power shift was no longer invisible. It was the only thing left in the room. "You're bluffing," Miller said, though his voice lacked the steel it had 5 minutes ago. "You wouldn't sink the firm. You're tied to it. You go down with the ship." "I'm not on the ship, Miller," I said, standing up slowly. "I sold my shares in July. The moment I found out about Sarah, I started looking into everything I had taken for granted. I realized that if the woman in my bed was a lie, the men in my boardroom probably were too. I haven't been an officer of that company for 90 days. I'm just a private citizen selling his home." I understood that the moral closure I needed wasn't going to come from a confession or a public apology. It was coming from this, the sight of the architect's hand being forced. I walked past him, out of the study and toward the front door. The mover's truck was finally pulling into the driveway, a massive white box that blocked out the sun. "The house is clean, Miller," I said, not looking back. "The ledger you're looking for isn't in the vent. It hasn't been there for weeks. What I found today was a copy I planted to see who would come looking for it. The original is already in a vault 300 miles from here." I realized that the silent endurance had paid off. By playing the part of the grieving, obsessed husband, I had made myself seem small and distracted. I had let them think I was focused on a petty domestic betrayal while I was actually building a fortress of evidence. I reached the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp, smelling of turning leaves and new beginnings. Sarah was there. She had come back, her car idling at the curb behind the mover's truck. She wasn't there to fight. She was standing by the "For Sale" sign, looking at the house as if she were seeing it for the first time. I walked down the steps, my gait steady, my mind clear. I realized that I didn't feel the need to gloat. The consequences of her actions and the actions of the men in that house were unfolding naturally. I didn't need to push them. Gravity was doing the work for me. I stopped in front of her. She looked at me, her eyes red-rimmed, searching my face for a flicker of the man she had cheated on. She didn't find him. "I'm leaving, Mark," she said quietly. I wanted to know if any of it was real." "Before Sedona. Before the sign." "It was a structure, Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of malice. "But a structure without maintenance eventually collapses. I'm just the one who called the demolition crew." I handed the keys to the lead mover, a man who didn't know he was participating in the end of a decade. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at Miller, who was now standing on the porch, watching his world vanish into the back of a moving van. I realized that the highest form of dominance is the ability to walk away from the wreckage you've created without a single regret. I got into my car. The weight of the last 6 months had lifted, replaced by a quiet, profound satisfaction. I had protected my assets, I had exposed the corruption, and I had maintained my dignity. I understood that the moral victory wasn't in the revenge, but in the clarity of the exit. As I drove away, I saw the "For Sale" sign in the rearview mirror. It was no longer a symbol of loss. It was a sold sign in everything but the lettering. I had sold the past to buy the future, and for the first time in a long time, the price was exactly what I was willing to pay. I turned the corner, the house disappearing from view. The road ahead was open, silent, and entirely mine. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.